I have the great pleasure to be here with Peter Bakker, the CEO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The World Business Council is known to most of us, but just a couple of facts as we get started. It consists of 200 leading companies, altogether 19 million employees or $8.5 trillion in turnover. Huge numbers. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development has had lots of impact for their participants or the companies, but they've also pushed the agenda on sustainability more broadly. So I'll just mention two things. People tell me how important they were in establishing the SDGs. So that's one. Another one, maybe more recent and even more important, the so-called Task Force for Climate Disclosure, where the World Business Council for Sustainable Development brought in the industry perspective. In my opinion, a big breakthrough in this space. Peter has been the CEO for 10 years. Before that, he was the CEO of TNT, a global logistics company, and a sustainability proponent for a very long time. So Peter, welcome to this discussion. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Knut.
You've been important in one more way, which is closer to IMD. You have, through the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, been our friend and challenger on the MBA for the last year, which is incredibly important for us. So just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
And then go to recent events. You're just back from Egypt, from the COP27, big meeting. Some say it's a success, some are more hesitant. What is your perspective?
Yeah, whenever I think about the COP outcomes, and this has been there for a few years now, it's a glass half full, glass half empty. On the one hand, there's progress being made. For the first time, loss and damage fund has now been in the conversations, which will really bring the developing world onto the agenda and make them feel recognized for the damage that climate change will do to some of their countries. So that's good news. On the other hand, the negotiation result on banning out fossil fuels is deeply disappointing and not at all aligned with where the world needs to move. So from that point of view, I think it's always important to realize that climate change will not be solved by the text that is negotiated in these COPs. Where climate change is being solved is by reducing emissions. And that's always the other part of a COP, and that part is actually getting more and more important, which is where the real economy and the financial economy meet. So this year in Egypt, there were more than 50,000 participants. We thought it would not be an important COP, but it became one of the biggest COPs ever. And a big part of those participants were in the real economy conversations, talking about how do we decarbonize? What is transition financing about? How do we keep each other accountable for the progress we're making? So that's what I mean with half full, half empty. Negotiations are difficult and take a long time. Geopolitically, a good thing that we're still as one world talking about it. Climate conversations between China and the USA have now been restarted, which were stopped because of tensions between those countries. So there's positives in there, but the real world economy, that's where I think progress will have to happen.
And tell us a little bit about the business transformation as you see it, because of course you see the different industries, you see the large companies. How fast is it moving? How important is it going to be, in your opinion?
So one factor is that 75% of emissions in the world originates from private sector. That's a very important number to keep in mind, because if it is not business that will lead to decarbonization, then the world will not decarbonize fast enough. So it is essential that we get companies to set net zero targets, that companies understand this science and translate that into the speed at which they need to decarbonize. It's essential that companies create plans to make those transformations happen. And I see it now happen. The amount of companies that have set net zero targets is now almost 10,000 of the large companies in the world. That's not all of them, but a very important number. The companies that are beginning to disclose their transition plans is also growing. And that creates an environment where best practices emerges and where companies who may not be large multinationals, but smaller companies can begin to look at these plants and say, how can we copy that into our operations and begin to decarbonize that as well? The other big factor that has really emerged last year in Glasgow, but it became stronger even this time in Egypt, is the financial sector has now embraced this as an important and a recognized risk. So the task force for climate-related financial risk played an important role in that. But in Glasgow last year, a thing called GVANS was announced, where all the leading investors and banks came together to work on decarbonization plans. And that's where I get a lot of optimism. You see the amount of companies that are now embracing the need to transform. If you begin to see the financial sector understanding the risks and investment opportunities in those transitions, then you can see that the system is going to change. Is it going fast enough? Not yet. We need to do more. And so the next COP will be another opportunity to really ratchet up the speed at which we make change.
And in this big picture, with the very complex political challenges and unpredictability, how do you see sustainability and climate staying on the agenda?
Yeah, in business, it's not going to drop off anymore. So what I say, sustainability has gone mainstream. This is no longer about philanthropy or about CSR. It's now really deeply embedded in the strategies of companies, in the operating plans and the CapEx plans of companies. What I see is, yes, there's an incredibly complex world out there, energy security, inflation, and all the other topics that are currently on the agenda. It might mean that the broad sustainability agenda will slow down a bit, but the one on climate is now so robustly, the need to decarbonize, the fact that accounting rules are now coming towards business that will make them have to disclose the progress they're making. That movement is not going to go away anymore. And as that movement gathers momentum, what you begin to see is that industries are actually beginning to transform. Now look at the automotive sector. 5 years ago, if you walked into a boardroom saying, you guys are going to have to stop building combustion engines, 10 years from now, they would have sent you out of the room. Today, if you say by 2030 combustion engines are over, everybody would say, yeah, that's probably right in most developed markets. And therefore, all their R&D dollars are now actually going into electrification and other solutions. And actually, if you begin to look at the valuation models in capital markets, that R&D that is still spent on optimizing combustion engines is being treated as stranded assets, will not be included in valuations anymore. So I think from that point of view, yes, the world is complex. That's not going to change anytime soon. But the climate is now such a, I would almost say, short-term emergency that is just not going to go away.
And when you interact with CEOs, do you sense that there's a move from climate as a risk to also towards climate as an opportunity? How do they think about climate today as compared to, say, 5 years ago?
No, I think the conversation has basically moved from why is it important 5 years ago, what do I need to do about it 3 years ago, to how am I going to get this done? It's really now how do I decarbonize the factories I have or the supply chain I run? How can I innovate faster than my competitors to bring solutions to the market? What I find very interesting as maybe an example of that is Japan is one of the leading industrial countries in the world. Up until 3-4 years ago, whenever I would go to Japan, I would have tough conversations with the Employers Association there because, Peter, you can't talk about this decarbonization, carbon pricing, we don't want to hear about it. Now, Japan has set itself a net zero target as a country for the first time. Every Japanese industrial company is looking, wow, we need to now turn our R&D investments into creating solutions. The problem they have recognized is, if we spend all that money in solutions, how will we get recognized for those solutions? And that is now a new concept is emerging, which is called avoided emissions. So if a product has a better emission performance than a traditional product, then you avoid emissions. If you invest in creating avoided emission solutions, then how will you measure that? Our organization, WBCSD, has now been asked to prepare for the next G7 the framework on how companies should disclose their avoided emission strategies. And that will then be agreed upon G7 level, i.e. become the norm of how you do it. And in my mind, that will give an enormous boost to the innovation into opportunities. Both risks, because we also have to be honest, if you look at the most recent summer, where rivers in Europe, rivers in China were running really low on water levels, making water transport almost impossible, supply chains as a result of it coming to a halt. It's also a real risk agenda, a resilience agenda. So I think climate in companies' strategies and operating plans, both the how do we make our supply chains resilient for changes which we know will be unavoidable, even if we stay below 1.5 degrees, versus how can we actually, through our capex and innovation, create solutions that will avoid emissions. That is going to be the two big plays.
So that's almost saying the glass is both half full and half empty. It's both. And maybe last question to you, Peter. So, of course, we're a business school. You do a lot of education. When you think about developing leadership in the future, and I'm not just thinking about the young leaders of the future, it's all of us as leaders in the future. What do you see as most important and the biggest changes?
Yeah, I think the only way that we're going to create solutions in sustainability at the speed and the scale that we need it, if we fundamentally rethink the economic model by which society operates. Some people call it we need to change capitalism. And that's not to say that capitalism is bad, it has functioned really well. But the time that we can only look at financial performance and ignore environmental or social impacts, those days are over. So we need to find ways to integrate environmental risks and opportunities, just as we just discussed on climate, into corporate decision making, into corporate strategies, eventually into corporate disclosures, and into capital market valuation models. That means that if you want to be a leader of the business in the future, you cannot just understand discounted cash flow models and shareholder-centric ways of optimizing a business. You have to begin to understand, how do I actually integrate the environmental impact, both bad and both good? What are plans to improve the environmental impacts or the social impacts? How do I present that to my stakeholders, my shareholders, in order for those capital market players to then give me a lower cost of capital? So what I'm saying is the rules of the game in business are changing. It is no longer, I have cash flow, I put it in a discounted cash flow model, and that's where my valuation come out. Environmental and social impacts need to be integrated into that. But before you integrate them, you need to be able to manage them so that they show improvement. And that skill set needs to really be embedded now in the leadership training that we give. And that's why, we, as you mentioned, are very happy to be partnering with IMD, because this is one of the first schools where actually in the MBA program, there's an attempt underway to replace the shareholder-centric only model with a more holistic, sustainability-led teaching model and curriculum. And I think that's absolutely the future.
Super. So Peter, let me use this occasion to again say thank you, not only for what you're doing now with IMD, but also more generally what you're pushing ahead on. In a sense, leadership has become more meaningful because we have to do something and we have to do it together. So thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Knut.